Okay, we should be good to go now. So your next week assignment is line, which is slightly complicated by the timeline. So it's not due this Friday, not due, let's see, that would be the 5th. It's due next Friday. So I will be back all next week to follow up with any questions that you guys might have, but my intention here is to run through the PowerPoint that I would normally go through and then just show you a couple of do's and don'ts from student examples. So I'll go fairly quickly here. That way, if you want to go quick, you can, but if you need to pause, you can do that to write down any sort of notes, and I'll point those out to you. So, line. Here we can see there's lots of lines. There's going to be lines in almost any photograph that you take. However, the project goals will be how effectively you can use them in a principle of design. So, again, to clarify the the project goals are use the element of line to show a principle of design. Here you could argue a whole bunch of things. You could say contrast between light and dark. I think the better answer is movement, and still the better answer would be rhythm because you have repeating elements leading the viewer's eye. Lots of interesting complex lines are really aiding the success of this photo. It's quite a bit more straightforward. Train tracks, roads, stripes on roads, fences, of course, are very commonly used for this project. They're accessible, they work. This is a particularly interesting one, not only because of the line, which we can see really clearly the movement being created through the use of line and the railroad tracks, but it's got interesting textures, interesting light through the fog and everything, so there's a lot of elements going on here. I forget which classes I've mentioned it to, but realistically I could and probably should rename each of the assignments light/line or light/ what other additional element, because lighting is going to make a very big difference on the overall success of your photo. Here's your classic fence. Yep, there's movement, there's rhythm, it's working. However, where this is going to fall short and where most pictures of train tracks, fences, roads fall short is overall engagement and originality. You can shoot along stair banisters, fences, all these things, and have a principle and have it be effective. However, without some additional element or engaging subject matter, it's unlikely to be a really successful photo, like in a 5 category. One term I want to point out to you is the concept of an implied line. So the dominant line in this image is the line of trees running back here. There is no physical line leading us back. However, there is an implied line. So an implied line is a line that is suggested or implied but doesn't actually exist. It's another great way to create movement or rhythm, and it's quite effective here. And depending how you use it, it can be a good idea for this project or not because of how obvious it is. Here's another random old student photo. Clearly there's lines, sense of emphasis and movement, successful. You can have contrasting lines, so you have clean curved lines here and straight lines leading towards a point of emphasis, in this case, focal point. And again, we see light playing a significant role here. This has got implied and sort of actual lines. It's working for movement. I would say visually it's pretty cluttered. There's a lot going on. I find it a little too busy, and most of that's due to the Photoshop work that they did here. But texturally and everything, it is pretty interesting. But simple often really does work. If you have a simple image, it should be clean, free of distracting elements, free of things in the background that are taking away from what you were trying to show in your composition. Again, the rubric states that there's evidence of design skill. Can I see clear purpose or intention behind how you did this, or did it just maybe happen on its own? Another example of lines, nothing particularly interesting to say here. This line here is a little bit more varied and interesting. Birds on a line. Yep. Here's a more subtle way that line's being used. You have the railing leading us to a focal point, the little boy. Quite effective use of emphasis and movement here. Perspective. For the line assignment, perspective is going to make all the difference. Whether my eye is led along a line or between lines, or there just is a line that is unengaging, is largely going to be down to perspective. So one of my favorite things that's done here is the portrait's turned on its side, so you view these lines as the dominant line rather than the profile of the face. Not to mention, once again, the lighting is playing a really big role here, with the backlighting making the hair glow. This is addressing the idea that you can achieve some sense of implied line by having your subject look in a certain direction. Much like if someone was looking and pointing at the top of a building, you would look at the top of the building. It actually works fairly well in photos. You'll see a subject first, and then you'll look at where they're looking. Here again, you probably saw her face first, and then, the red arrows shooting out of her face probably helped, but then you'll shoot down to here, maybe back down to there. I don't know that I'd really advise this for a design element, as it isn't always super successful, and it's a pretty vague way of interpreting implied line. Henri Cartier-Bresson. You need to know him in the sense that A, he's on the exam, and B, probably recognized as one of, if not the greatest photographers of all time. French, the particular thing you need to know about him is he's known as a street photographer, which means he took pictures of kind of everyday life on the street in public. They're candid shots, they're not staged. This is one of his more famous images, although he has many. I think this is a great example of a term that he coined, which is the decisive moment. The idea that there's this split second of time where you capture an expression or an action or a scene, and in that split second of time, it's made a great image instead of an okay image. And certainly here, a split second before, there's a man standing on a ladder. A split second after, there's going to be a man in a puddle. But right here, as his foot is about to touch that mirror-like surface, you get that really unique mirroring, that unique shape being highlighted and duplicated. Here, the man with a fantastic mustache turns to glare at us, capturing that split second. Look at that line right there. And use of perspective. Use of light, gesture. Creating quite a bit more emotion and information about the relationship of the mother and daughter, even though you can't see one of their faces at all. He also did travel photography, which is basically like street photography, except in more exotic locations like Africa, China. I find this particularly interesting because you've got people standing in a line, and this is during a time of famine in China, and this is a soup kitchen line. And obviously it's a very chaotic line to be in, but visually it's quite chaotic as well. The interacting and jaggedy shapes formed by the arms and elbows and jackets, I think replicates the emotion that's in it. Here, another example of setting up a composition through perspective and timing, the decisive moment, waiting for the bicyclist to come around, and this line leading us to the focal point and taking the picture exactly then. And here, implied line down to a focal point. Ooh, that's a heck of a quote. Basically, he's talking about the idea of the mind's eye, which is basically being able to envision what the photo will look like as you're standing in front of your subject. Oof. Yeah, you can watch all the YouTube on your own. Student examples. Here's the photo 1 example. It's a mirror, 6 forks, and a deliberately set up light. It's simple, it's clean, it's effective design. It's clearly very carefully thought out and set up. That's how you get a 5. Quite a bit simpler. Use of perspective, quite deliberate perspective, and effective rhythm and movement back. Fence. Quite an interesting fence. I don't know that it gets to a 5, but we do see really clear movement back. Yep, sure. Rhythm, movement, line. Not all that engaging or that imaginative, but it is there. Same story. We've seen blinds before. An interesting perspective, super up close of a leaf. You know, guitar and guitar strings pretty obvious for the line assignment, but I do appreciate that they have carefully thought about perspective and lighting. Ooh. There are lots of lines here in the trees, and I assume the photographer was intending this path to be the effective design element here, and it just isn't. It's too dark, doesn't stand out. Compositionally, it really doesn't work. Similarly here, we're not just lining things up, okay? That technically does have lines, and those are in a line, but there's no principle of design really being effectively shown here through the line. So that is the PowerPoint. Let's see what we get real quick if we type in line photos. We go to people I follow. We can see some do's and don'ts. Use of light here is nice. Use of perspective here, very good. Here again, balance with the line. I think reflection is a great tool here. Unique perspectives. We're not looking for printed or manufactured lines. They really don't. I mean, how much imagination did it take for you to identify those lines? Not a lot of work on the photographer's perspective there. But there are interesting lines just in everyday objects. Certainly lines created through the use of light. Interesting subjects being added. Oh, let's throw it real back. This was by Caitlin. You know, AP can utilize Photoshop to kind of fabricate compositions. Stuff like this, Google. Oh, that was actually a Google image. This was a weird assignment, which I'll talk about here in just a minute. Again, light. Perspective, line throughout the composition, rhythm, movement. This has rhythm and it has movement. It's just not engaging. Same story here. I would probably avoid something as simple as this. Actually, that's just flat printed. I would definitely avoid that. Forks, we've seen plenty of those. Books, pretty obvious too. Oh, and Reagan's. Oh, we got all kinds of siblings here. Again, I'm just telling you, light's where it's at. Okay, so what we're looking for here is the principle of design being executed through the use of line. This photo will be due next Friday. So that's the Friday of the week that I get back. So I should have plenty of time to do things. All of the things that you've got already assigned, your principles of design, your practice mat board, your practice photo, your light photo, which should have already been done. I certainly hope anyone that wanted to turn that in late has that ready. Those are all due Friday, which when you're listening to this video should be tomorrow. You are going to get a couple more assignments early next week. We're going to do some essay critiques during class, and I believe we'll start potentially our first actual mat board. So you should be very busy. Do make sure that you get everything done that you need to get done. If you have already started taking pictures for line, great. I hope they do work with the explanation that I've given today. If you have questions, you can email me. But yep, that should be the goal. Thanks.